On a Thursday morning in February, a man came into a barbershop on West Adams Boulevard in Los Angeles, took off a canvas hat that had been on his head long enough to have shaped itself permanently to it, and sat down in the chair closest to the window. He did not ask for a price. He did not ask for a consultation. He sat down the way a person sits when they have not been offered a chair in a long time and are not certain they are allowed to be in one. The barbershop owner looked at him for a moment. He saw the coat, the shoes, the particular stillness of a man who has learned to take up as little space as possible. He picked up his comb. "What are we doing today?" he said. Not, "Do you have money?" Not, "We don't do walk-ins." Not, "The chair is reserved." What are we doing today? He never charged the man. The man never came back alone. There is a barber shop on West Adams Boulevard in Los Angeles, in the Adams Normandy neighborhood, called Cutler's. One chair, one mirror, one waiting bench along the south wall, with a cushion that has been reupholstered twice since the shop opened. The window faces west and catches the afternoon light in a way that makes the shop look warmer from outside than from in, which the owner considers an acceptable inversion. A shelf above the mirror holds the tools in a specific order that has not changed in 9 years, because the owner has found that the order in which things are arranged is one of the things a person can control, and he has chosen to control it. A small radio on the windowsill. A framed photograph on the north wall of a man in a barber's apron, a man who is clearly the owner's father, grinning at something just outside the frame. The owner's name was Calvin Cutler. He was 47 years old, the son of a barber and the grandson of a barber, which in his family was understood as a lineage rather than a coincidence. His grandfather, Roosevelt Cutler, had learned the trade in Birmingham, Alabama, in the 1950s, in the particular way available to black craftsmen in that time and place, in a shop that served the community entirely because it had to, because the alternatives were not alternatives. His father, James Cutler, had brought the trade to Los Angeles in 1971, opened a shop on Figueroa Street in 1974, and worked it until his hands would not permit it anymore. Calvin had started sweeping floors at 11, held the con for the first time at 14 under James's instruction, and given his first full haircut at 16 to his cousin Marcus, who had been 16 years old and more patient than 16-year-olds usually are. Cutler's on West Adams had been open for 9 years. One chair, one barber. Calvin worked Tuesday through Saturday, 9 in the morning until the last client was done, which was sometimes 3 in the afternoon and sometimes 6. He did not take appointments, which was unusual and which he had considered carefully before deciding. The shop's rhythm was walk-in only. You came when you could come, you waited if you had to wait, and Calvin worked in the order people arrived. It charged $28 for a standard cut, $35 for a cut and beard. It had not raised his prices in 4 years, which his supplier considered a mistake and which Calvin considered a point of principle. The neighborhood was changing. The phrase everyone in Adams Normandy used when they meant the rents were going up and the faces were changing and the places that had served the community for decades were one by one becoming something else. Calvin had watched 3 barbershops close on the corridor in 6 years. He had watched a coffee shop open where one of them had been. It served $6 coffee from a machine behind the waiting bench, and did not consider this a contradiction. It was not a man who talked while he worked unless the client wanted to talk. He had learned this from James, who had said once that a barber's first job was to read the room in the chair. Whether the person wanted conversation or quiet, whether they needed to be asked questions or left to think. It had said, "The hair is never just the hair. Pay attention to what they came in carrying." Calvin paid attention. It had been paying attention for 9 years when the man in the canvas hat came through the door on a Thursday morning in February and sat down in the chair by the window. Calvin had seen the man before, not in the shop, on the block. He walked West Adams in the mornings when he opened, and the man was a presence on the corridor, quiet, unhurried, not aggressive in the way that sometimes made people cross the street, but carrying the particular invisibility of someone the city had decided to look through. He slept in the recessed doorway of the vacant commercial space 3 doors east of Cutler's. He had been there, on and off, for about 8 months. Calvin had nodded to him on the sidewalk. Twice. The man had nodded back. He knew nothing else about him. He did not know his name, He did not know how he had arrived at the doorway on West Adams or what his life had been before it. He had not asked. The man had not offered. When he came through the door of Cutler's and sat in the chair, Calvin made the read in the same second he always made it. He saw the coat and the shoes, and the hat that had been on the same head in the same weather for too long. He saw the specific stillness of a person who was waiting to be told they had made a mistake in sitting down. He saw the hands in the lap, not fidgeting, just resting, with the patience of someone who had learned to wait without expectation. He picked up his comb. "What are we doing today?" The man looked at him in the mirror. "I don't have money for this," he said, plainly, not as an apology, as a fact that needed to be on the table before anything else happened. Calvin said, "I heard you. What are we doing?" The man was quiet for a moment. "Whatever you think," he said. "It's been a while." Calvin looked at the hair. He looked at the beard. He made the assessment a barber makes, and then he went to work. He worked for 41 minutes. The haircut first, then the beard, cleaning the line, reducing the length, restoring a shape that had been there before and was still there underneath if you knew how to look for it. He did not rush. He did not perform generosity. He did not make conversation about the man's situation, or the shop's policy, or the neighborhood, or anything else that would have reminded the man of the weight of what was being given. He asked once, about halfway through, whether the sideline was better straight or slightly tapered. The man said straight. Calvin went straight. When he was done, he turned the chair toward the mirror. The man looked at himself. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you. Not for the haircut. For the 41 minutes. Calvin nodded once. He took the cape off, shook it once, hung it on the hook. The man stood. He put the canvas hat back on, then paused, looked at it, took it off again, and held it in his hand. He had not done that in a while either. He walked out. Calvin watched him go, then turned back to his station and reset for the next client, and that was the end of it, or so he thought. On a Tuesday, 10 days later, the door opened. The man in the canvas hat came in. With him, standing slightly behind and to the left in the way of someone following a guide through unfamiliar territory, was a second man, older. A coat that had been good once, 20 years ago. Shoes that needed new soles. The same quality of stillness. The man said, "This is Raymond. He was at the shelter on Hooper. I told him about you." Calvin looked at Raymond. "Have a seat," he said. Raymond sat. The man in the canvas hat sat on the bench and waited, his hat on his knee. Calvin worked for 38 minutes. When he was done, Raymond stood and looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He said quietly to no one in particular, "I forgot what I looked like." There is a particular thing that happens in a room when a person says something true without intending to. The room becomes slightly more real. Everything in it adjusts to accommodate the weight of the sentence. Calvin did not respond to what Raymond said. He did not need to. The sentence landed where it was supposed to land and stayed there. After Raymond and the man in the canvas hat had gone, Calvin stood at his station for a moment, looking at the north wall and the photograph of James Cutler grinning at something outside the frame. He thought about what his father had said about the hair never being just the hair. He thought about the man on the block, the one he had nodded to twice on the sidewalk. He had not asked his name. He had not asked it today either. The following Thursday, the man came back. He had with him a woman this time. 50s. A winter hat pulled low. The specific wariness of someone who has been turned away from enough places to assume it as a default. Calvin nodded at the chair. He did not ask questions. He made the read, and the read told him what to do, and he did it. He still did not know the man's name. It was 6 weeks before he asked. He asked because it had become strange not to. The man said his name was Curtis. Calvin said, "I'm Calvin. This is my father's shop." Curtis looked at the photograph on the north wall. "You can tell," he said. "How?" "It looks like someone takes care of it." By the time the man in the dark jacket came in on a Friday afternoon in March, Curtis had been bringing people to Cutler's for 7 weeks. The count, as Calvin kept it loosely in his head, Curtis first, then Raymond, then the woman in the winter hat whose name was Dolores. Then 3 men in 1 week, who had clearly been told to ask for Calvin specifically. Then a young woman of maybe 20 who came in alone on a Saturday morning and sat in the chair and began crying quietly about 4 minutes into the cut. And Calvin had kept working, gently, without comment, until she was done, because his father had also said that the chair was sometimes the first place people had been still enough for something they were carrying to catch up with them. 11 people in 7 weeks, all of them from the encampment on Hooper or the shelter network that Curtis moved through, all of them brought by word of mouth that Calvin had not sought and could not have organized if he had tried. He was not charging any of them. It was also not charging his regular clients. The two things ran side by side. On a Tuesday, it might cut 3 clients at $28 each, and then Curtis's friend at no charge, and the ledger at the end of the day reflected the Tuesday it was. It had not told anyone about it. He had not needed to. The man in the dark jacket walked in at 2:15 on a Friday in late March. It was tall, in a dark jacket, and worn jeans. And he came in the way people come into a room when they have been in many rooms and are not in the business of performing their arrival. He looked around. The chair, the waiting bench, the shelf above the mirror, the photograph on the north wall, the small radio on the windowsill, with the attention of someone genuinely looking. There was one person ahead of him on the bench. He sat and waited. He waited 40 minutes without taking out his phone. He did not drum his fingers or check the time. He sat the way Curtis sat on the bench, with the patience of someone at home in their own company. When the chair opened, he sat. Calvin made his read. He said, "What are we doing today?" The man said. "Whatever you think. You're the professional." Calvin smiled slightly. He went to work. They talked. Not immediately. Calvin let the first 10 minutes be quiet, and the man let it be quiet, which told Calvin something. Then they talked the way two people talk, when both of them understand that conversation is an offering and not an obligation. The man asked about the shop, about the photograph on the north wall, about James Cutler and Roosevelt Cutler before him. Calvin told him briefly, in the way he talked about his father, with the specific pride of a person who knows they are carrying something that was built before them and is theirs to carry well. The man asked about the neighborhood. Calvin told him about the corridor, the 3 barbershops that had closed, the coffee shop. The rents, he said it without bitterness, in the tone of a man reporting what is true. "Are you worried about the shop?" the man asked. Calvin considered it. "I'm not worried about the shop," he said. "I'm worried about the neighborhood not having a shop like this one. Those are different things." The man was quiet for a moment. "What makes a shop like this one?" Calvin looked at him in the mirror. "My grandfather's shop in Birmingham served everybody who came through the door," he said. "Not because of politics, because that was the community and the community needed a place. My father's shop on Figueroa was the same. He didn't set out to do something different. I just didn't set out to do something different." He made a small adjustment on the right side. "There's a man named Curtis," he said, "who's been sleeping 3 doors down for 8 months. He came in 7 weeks ago. He's brought 11 people since then. I didn't advertise. He didn't have a policy. I just answered the door." The man in the chair said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's the story." "What story?" "The whole one," the man said. "Right there." Calvin was not certain what he meant. He finished the cut, ran the line clean, and stepped back. The man looked at himself in the mirror. He nodded once, the nod of someone satisfied not with the result, but with the work. He reached into his jacket and put $120 on the shelf. Calvin started to say something and the man held up one hand very slightly. "For the 11, he said. He left the same way he had come in. No performance, no announcement. Calvin stood at the station and looked at the $120 on the shelf. On the north wall, James Cutler grinned at something outside the frame. On a Tuesday 6 weeks later, 2 things arrived within an hour of each other. The first was Curtis, with a man named Walter, who had been on the streets in Los Angeles for 3 years, and who sat in the chair with the same held-in stillness Calvin had learned to recognize in 7 weeks. Calvin worked for 34 minutes, and when Walter looked in the mirror, his eyes went somewhere private, and he did not speak for a while. And Calvin gave him the silence for as long as he needed. Eat. The second was an envelope, no return address, inside. A letter, 1 page, handwritten. Each side that the writer had heard about Cutler's from someone who had heard about it, and that he wanted to do something practical to help the shop continue doing what it was doing. Each said the writer was not interested in recognition or naming or any kind of formal arrangement. Each said the amount enclosed was for operating expenses, chair supplies, The cost of time, whatever the shop needed to keep the door open, in the way it was already open. The amount was $8,000. Tucked into the letter, on a separate slip of paper, was a phone number and 4 words: if you need more. Calvin read the letter twice. He put it in the drawer below the register, the one where he kept the things that mattered. He put the $8,000 in the business account the next morning, in the same deposit as the previous week's client payments, no separate category, no special marking, because it was for the shop and the shop was one thing. He did not call the number that week. He called it 3 months later, when the refrigerator compressor on the coffee machine failed, and the repair estimate was $340, and the week had been slow. A voice I recognized from the chair said, "I'll take care of it." Calvin said, "I want to pay you back." The voice said, "You already are." Curtis's name was Curtis Elmore. Calvin did not find this out from Curtis. He found it out from Dolores, who had known Curtis for 2 years before she came to the shop, because the network of people who live outside has its own geography and its own long memories. Curtis Elmore had grown up in Inglewood. He had worked in logistics for 11 years, warehouse coordination, a supervisor position he'd held for 4 years, and had lost the job in a restructuring and lost the apartment 6 months after that, when the savings ran out, and had spent the following 2 years moving through the shelter system and the encampment corridors of South Los Angeles. A was 54 years old. He had a daughter in Long Beach he spoke to by phone when he had access to a phone, which was not always. A was precise in his way. He did what he said he was going to do, which in the circumstances required more effort than it sounds. When he told someone at the shelter or the encampment about Calvin's shop, he told them the address and the days and the specific instruction: sit in the chair, tell him what you want, and let him work. He had said this to 22 people by the time Calvin found out his last name. Of the 22, 14 had come to the shop. Of the 14, 3 had come more than once. One of those 3, a man named Andre, 31, who had come in twice and sat in the chair with the focused stillness of someone conserving everything, had, in the month following his second visit, connected with a transitional housing coordinator Calvin had mentioned in passing, the way Calvin mentioned things, briefly as information without pressure. Andre had taken the information and done something with it. By spring, he had a room in a transitional facility in Culver City, and a part-time job with a landscape company that a regular client of Calvin's had mentioned had openings. Calvin had not orchestrated any of this. He had been a barber. James Cutler had a saying that Calvin had heard so many times as a child that it had stopped sounding like a saying and had become simply the texture of the shop. Aside, you give a man a good haircut, you give him his face back. His face is where he lives. Calvin had not thought about it in years. He had been hearing it since he was 9, and somewhere along the way it had moved from his memory into his hands, which was where the things that really form you end up. The morning after Andre told Calvin about the Culver City room, Calvin stood at his station and prepared for the Tuesday clients and thought about his grandfather's shop in Birmingham, and his father's shop on Figueroa and this shop on West Adams, and the specific thing that had stayed the same across all 3 of them, while everything else had changed. The chair was for anyone who sat in it. That was the whole policy. It had never needed to be written down. The shop turned 10 in November. Calvin did not plan anything. He opened at 9, the way he opened every day. The first client was a regular named Marcus, not his cousin Marcus, a different Marcus, though the name had always made Calvin smile, who came every 3 weeks and wanted the same thing every time, and got it. The second was Curtis, who came every 2 weeks now and had started in the past month to talk more than he used to, not about his life or his situation, about other things. The Lakers. A documentary he had seen at the library. A novel he was most of the way through. He had a library card. He had gotten it 6 weeks ago. He sat in the chair and Calvin worked, and the conversation moved the way good conversation moves, from one thing to another, with no destination in mind. When Calvin was done and Curtis stood and looked in the mirror, Calvin said, 10 years today. Curtis looked at the shop, the chair, the bench, the shelf, the radio, the photograph on the north wall. Good 10 years, he said. Calvin thought about it. Yes, he said. The right ones. Curtis picked up his hat. He looked at it for a moment. He put it back on. He went out the door. He kept coming back to the 41 minutes. not the $8,000. Not Andre's room in Culver City, not the 22 people Curtis told, or the 14 who came, or any of the things that moved in concentric circles outward from that Thursday in February. The 41 minutes. Calvin Cutler picked up his comb and went to work for 41 minutes without asking a single question about what it would cost him, or what he would get back, or who the man was, or who he might turn out to be. He did it the way his father taught him, and his grandfather taught his father, not as a policy, not as a program, not as anything that required a name, as the job, as the work the chair was for. I wonder sometimes what I would have done in that moment. Whether I would have made the same read, moved to the same conclusion with the same absence of hesitation. I would like to believe yes. I am not certain I am built with the same quiet certainty that Calvin Cutler had standing at that station. What I know is that "what are we doing today" is one of the most generous sentences in this story, because it skips everything. It skips the question of whether the person deserves the chair. It skips the accounting. It goes straight to the work, which is the only place that was ever worth going. 4 words. 40, 1 minute, 14 people. That is the math of it, if you want the math. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known reputation for private generosity and for showing up in people's lives without announcement and leaving without needing to be thanked. Drop a comment and tell me what stayed with you from this one. Share it with someone who does the quiet thing, the thing no audience sees. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. See you in the next one.